Hello everyone, hope you're okay. And today I just want to show you this course about B2B activities in e-commerce. So we're going to focus mostly on how the internet has helped many businesses to do better operations. So basically this unit is very focused on increasing efficiency. And before I start, I just want to say that, well, the reason I covered this topic is because I believe that a lot of companies, I mean, a lot of schools focus on how to sell and how to increase sales. And this is indeed the focus when the economy is going well. But the problem is when the economy is going through a recession or the industry where you are working is not doing so well, then instead of increasing sales, a lot of times the priority becomes about increasing efficiency. So that's exactly what I want to talk about today, about some interesting topics, some interesting points to discuss. The first thing I want to talk about is about the concepts of outsourcing and offshoring. Now, these two concepts obviously are very similar, but they're not the same. Well, starting with outsourcing, basically this is when we use the organizations to perform specific activities, and this is more typically in manufacturing, although we do see that the service industry is indeed using a lot of outsourcing as well, but normally it always has to be or has to do with outsourcing of tangible goods. Although, like I said, there's many exceptions. For example, many business schools, they outsource their lecturers in the sense that they don't hire them, but rather, well, they hire them, obviously. They don't hire them for a contract, but rather they hire them as an outsourced company, as a service provider. Now, outsourcing has many advantages, like focusing allows companies to better focus on their core tasks. In other words, on the tasks that add value to the final product. Many companies believe there's no point of actually trying to do certain tasks that will not give any value for them or for their clients. So they ask themselves the question, what are the things that we do that we're really good at and that add value to our consumer, to our client? All the rest probably should outsource. Another option that we have obviously is that it allows us to lower costs. So for example, if you decide to create a website for your company, it's much easier when you outsource that development for another company, someone that has much more experience doing it. Well, the advantage not only is the fact that it's faster most of times, but also the fact that it will actually cost less. So you don't have to hire someone just to create a website, for example, and work full-time on it. Rather, many small companies rather just outsource it. And nowadays, for the very low prices, you can do that. For example, if you want to create your own website, you can go, for example, to wix.com, which is a great site to create your small website, and it will allow you, for example, to not only do the management yourself, but in a way you are outsourcing it because another company has developed the technology for it. Another one is to promote growth. So by focusing on what we're doing better allows us to promote better growth. In other words, it allows us to really focus not on the everyday activities, but focus more on developing the company itself. Maintaining operational control, although this, I would say, it's a little bit of a, you have to be careful, it's a little bit of a mixed blessing, let's say. Why? Because if you outsource certain activities, indeed you focus more on the things that you do because you have less things to focus on. But at the same time, what will happen is if these activities that you outsource, in a way you lost control over them because you're not the one that is doing the decisions every day. So there is here a mixed blessing, but overall I consider it a positive thing. The other one is offer staffing flexibility. So by outsourcing, for example, it allows us to have a little bit more of a backup plan in case of demand needs. Example, many hotels use temporary agent workers when their demand suddenly boosts due to an event or due to for example, a festival or due to any circumstance. Now, you don't want to hire someone on contract just because you know that that demand will only last, let's imagine, 2 or 3 weeks. But outsourcing this work allows definitely for an improvement in terms of flexibility, and therefore you don't have the long-term costs associated with it. The other one is provides continuity and risk management, because basically when you outsource, you also outsource the risk. And finally, you can also develop your internal staff better by focusing on the value that you actually create. So outsourcing is indeed hiring other companies to do this work. The The other part is offshoring. Offshoring, on the other hand, is more about outsourcing done by organizations in other countries. In other words, it's not just doing another organization. Offshoring is more specific in the sense you go more global. It's in another country. Now, typically, many business processes are offshored. For example, things like purchasing, research development, record keeping, information management, so on. So this is things that is very normal to actually outsource, but I do not recommend that you outsource all those things immediately. For example, some of these things you have to be a little bit careful. Example, research and development. Obviously, if you are a research and development company, you cannot outsource it because you would be outsourcing your research or development, which is your value-added activity. So therefore, again, you need to adapt all the things that you see to the real situation of the company. In terms of, now I want to focus more a little bit on purchasing activities, and actually I'm going to talk quite a bit about it because there's a lot of things here to talk. So purchasing activities, what are we talking about? We're talking about, for example, dealing with anything that we have to purchase. I think that makes a lot of sense actually, but we're dealing basically with the activities related to dealing with suppliers. Now, in that sense, there's a lot of things that could be said, but I'm just going to focus on what I believe are the top topics. Number one, what is the type of activities we typically outsource when we're saying outsourcing of purchasing activities? We're talking about identification and evaluation of vendors, first of all. So we're talking here about finding new vendors and actually evaluating to see, are they worth to work for? Do they have the prices? Do they have the delivery systems that we need? We also talk about selecting specific, allows us to select specific products. For example, Alibaba is a great site for B2B because if you're looking for specific products, Alibaba, probably you can find those products there. And indeed, here we're talking about really knowing what is the product that you need to buy. All right, so obviously you need someone that has a lot of knowledge on it. We're also talking about the fact of placing orders, obviously, and finally resolving any issues after the receipt of the goods or the services, like problems or returns and so on. So here, obviously, but the goal of purchasing is always the same. Typically, all right, the goal of purchasing is to buy components at the lowest price possible via binding. And binding means that the suppliers, for example, might compete in order to provide you with the best price that they can. Now, in terms, keeping on this topic, but now talking a little bit on the side, which is the concept of procurement and supply chain management. Those two things mean pretty much the same. There's a couple of differences, but at the end of the day, we're talking here about all the purchasing activities, all the monitoring of the purchase transaction elements, the managing and development of suppliers' relations. So we're talking about really the integrated aspect regarding purchasing and supply chain. Procurement staff, therefore, this is people that typically have a very high product knowledge because they need to identify and evaluate the right suppliers. And here sometimes we have to do with specific products. For example, I have a friend of mine that works as a supply chain manager. He's an engineer by trade, but because the components he buys are so specific, you don't have a manager in this case. Well, he is a manager, right? But you don't have a manager by training in this position. Rather, you need an engineer to make sure that what you're buying is exactly what you're buying. And since that he works in the airline industry, the components he buys for manufacturing of planes are therefore need to be very precise and very careful. And that's why, for example, you need to have someone that really understands what is the product. So sourcing here, when we talk here about sourcing, we're talking about the identification of suppliers and their qualifications. So remember, it's not always about the fact that you're talking just about the lowest price. Sometimes it might be also the technical aspect of the product. So e-sourcing, on that sense, obviously is the use of the internet for all these sourcing activities, which has allowed us to approach and contact much more suppliers than we had before. Just to give you an idea about how the internet has changed all this, what you see now on the board, I know the camera is blocking a little bit of it, but I think you get the point. This is the traditional paper-based process of purchasing. So first of all, business purchasing is much more complex than personal purchasing. And on that sense, there's many more documents, there's many more approvals and people involved than in a normal process of buying. So here what we have is all the steps that would create. So all the boxes you see, basically, that means that a document or something that must be created, and all the arrows means a point of communication, so that information growing from one place to another. And as you can see, this is extremely complex, and this is just to evaluate indeed all the things that need to be purchased. So in terms of materials now, material management, the part that I want to say here is that there's two main characteristics here. For the ones who don't know, there are typically we divide the inputs in the organization into two categories. One is called direct materials, the other one indirect materials. So direct materials is things that are part of the finished product. For example, if you're making guitars, then wood would be a direct material because it's part of the final product. Indirect materials are all the other materials that the company purchases, but does not necessarily mean they go into the product. So for example, a school might buy cleaning products, but that does not mean it goes into the education of the students. But it is needed in order to be able to perform the services or the product that we need. So indirect materials are things that we buy, but not necessarily are part of the final product. So here, obviously, when it comes to direct materials, much more important to manage that because it adds much more value to the final product. Indirect materials, typically, it's something a little bit more, let's say it's just not so much important because there's not such a direct impact on the final profit of the organization. So when it comes to buying materials, there's two main types of contract you can have. As you know, there you can have a contract, which is a much more long-term material contract, where you say, for example, this company A will be the supplier for these materials for the next 5-10 years, for example. That's a very long material contract. Actually, typically it's for 1 year, 2 years. But then there's the other one, which is called as well spot purchasing. And spot purchasing is much more about purchase made loosely organized, let's say. So it's more on the spot market, which means that you don't plan them so much long term, but you basically every week or every month, for example, you place an order to a supplier for this kind of product. Obviously, it will depend a lot on the things. Many businesses have many different suppliers, for example, so they only do spot purchasing in order not to tie themselves to an organization. But other businesses prefer to do a more long-term contract because it allows us to obtain better prices, for example. So each one of the contracts has advantages and disadvantages, and you have to consider that depending on the type of manufacturing or product you have. So this logistics, another thing I want to talk about is the logistics of the activities. And although I spoke a little bit about it before, but all I want to say here is that, well, typically what we have is we have what we call third-party logistics, or 3PL, which is providers that operate the customer material movement activities. Many businesses are good at manufacturing, but that does not mean they're good at transportation. So therefore, they hire a transportation company to make sure that the materials arrive at the place they need on the time they need. But what I want to say is this, there's logistics in two different senses. On the inputs, the materials that arrive to the organization, and on the outputs, the materials that go out of the organization. And I think a key question that many businesses don't think about is the question, if I organize the logistics, if me as a company organize logistics, does this add value to my client, to my consumer? And we have to understand here that sometimes what we see is that many companies skip this step and they lose a great opportunity, because remember, when you deliver, especially the final product, when you deliver the final product, you have a moment to interact with your customer. Now, for example, if you are doing a flower delivery service and you hire just someone to deliver the flowers, like let's imagine a company like Globo, which they deliver everything nowadays, and what happens is then you, the company that provides the flowers, you lose a great moment to make an impression on your customers, because especially delivering flowers such that is very connected with the emotions or with good moments, and therefore that can be a great way to lose that opportunity. I do understand that sometimes the costs that you save from outsourcing are huge, but at the end of the day, we have to understand, what do we want? We want to save costs, or do we want to have the opportunity of creating a memorable impression with our customers? And there is no direct answer here. It really depends from case to case. So we've been talking about outsourcing and so on, and different things you can outsource, but what are the top activities that typically are outsourced? Typically, we have human resource management, finance and administrative tasks, and technological development. The table that you see at the bottom is some activities, for example, that for each one of those things that are typically outsourced. So for example, for finance and administration, typically we'll outsource payment of suppliers to a, for example, to a software that does that automatically, or process payment from customers, or planning capital expenditures, and budgeting, for example. All those things can be outsourced. In terms of human resource management, many companies, for example, do the hiring of employees for an outsourced company, or training, or evaluation of employees, and so on. And finally, the last one is technological development. So for example, many business schools use Blackboard or use Canvas for their classes. Now, why doesn't the school simply create their own platform? Because they know it will not be as good as the one that they outsource to. So as you can see, these kind of things are extremely ambiguous, let's say, from company to company, because there's so many exceptions. But I just wanted to give you an idea of the top 3 that are indeed outsourced throughout the most businesses, let's say. The next concept I want to talk with you is the concept of supply web. So obviously this has to do with the relationship again with the customers, or with the suppliers. And here, what we see is that compared to some years ago, where companies were very hierarchical, there is a shift from this hierarchical structure to more of a network structure. What does that mean? It means that nowadays we don't do everything in the company. So we tend to outsource certain things, for example, to other companies. So this has created a very big shift, because basically what we're doing is, like you see on the slide, more and more we outsource non-value added activities, and therefore we become dependent upon a network. Now, so what happens is I might outsource my HR to a different company. That HR company also outsources some of their activities to other companies, and so on, so on. So there is here a web, there is here a domino effect, let's say, because we're all dependent on a variety of companies. And what would happen is you end up with the internet has allowed this new structure. Now, we could talk for hours about this and about the implications, about the advantages, disadvantages, but this is the reality of what's going on right now, is this effect of the supply web. What is the implication in terms for businesses? The implication is that we are much more connected with other companies. Therefore, we have an opportunity as well of establishing new networks or new contacts. But at the same time, when things go wrong, that means there might be a domino effect. And therefore, if your supplier for some reason goes bankrupt or there's a scandal, then you are also affected by that. And we need to have that into consideration. When we outsource, we also outsource the risk, is true, but that does not mean that we are free of risk, all right? So another concept I want to talk with you about, it's a very important one in B2B businesses. Many of you maybe already heard about it. It's the concept of electronic data interchange. So this is basically, let's say, a language, okay, or a document language that allows computer to computer business information to be transferred in a standard format. So EDI is basically we use EDI with its compatible firms interchange data in specific formats, and this has allowed the fact that data can be therefore exchanged in much easier format. For example, we could consider Word documents or PDF as EDI, a very basic EDI, all right, on the sense that when I use this software, then you can send me data, I can read and understand the data, I can modify it, for example, and send it back. But EDI is much more than this. EDI is much more automated, and the processes that are created means that the data automatically is created. A little bit, for example, we could talk about when you go to a self-checkout counter, you click on the products, for example, creates a bill, and this automation is a little bit like this, but it's a little bit like IDI works, but on the sense that there are different companies involved. So this is now the dominant technology for electronic B2B transactions, because it's so big that a lot of people, it's funny that a lot of people don't know when there's such a huge amount of information that on the web goes through these type of systems. So how does EDI work? Well, before we get started, let me say the basic idea is very straightforward. It allows me to exchange information with another company and make that information be processed automatically. So very easy to understand. So the concept is straightforward. The problem is the implication. It's hard. It's extremely hard, because sometimes it means you have to change the whole software in a company and then bring the old data to the new software. And that might mean that a lot of times that can take months to do this. All right. Many business schools, for example, when they change the software, sometimes takes them up to 2 years to be able to integrate all the information from previous years into the new system. So the implementation is indeed complicated. But let's here go through an example. Let's imagine that I need to purchase a new machine, for example, and on the first step, I'm going to show you what is the process on a paper-based system, and then on a purchasing with the EDI system. Actually, instead of buying machine, let's imagine it's buying of components, but I need to do this in a way every month or every week even. So on the right, what you see, I'm covering a little bit some of the documents, but what you see is that there's the side of the buyer, the vendor, there's the mail, and there's the bank. In order to avoid it, let's say, extra complication, I did not do the steps for the bank itself. I just put it as a box there. But what you see is that every step that you see there is a document being generated, and it's information being transmitted from one place to another. Before the internet, this would take, God, so much time. Okay, even though that with the internet, I remember, for example, I was talking with a friend of mine that used to do work on this before all these automated processes starts, and he said that the whole process could take up, when efficient, 2 to 3 days. And that means that that's a huge amount of time and resources being spent just to create orders. This also, the other problem here is that the documents could go missing. A lot of people were employed just to create these documents, so it's extremely inefficient. Now you might think, for example, okay, this is now over with the invention of the internet. Well, not really. Many companies still, for example, send their invoices by paper or to other businesses, or for example as well, need to create all these documents, but more in an electronic format through email, but the documents are still there. EDI is very different. Now, what you see here is that EDI eliminates most of those documents because the software does it all automatically, and there is more automatic information being connected. There's no more mail. There's a EDI network, or the software that does the translation between documents, all right, from the supplier to the buyer. Okay, and this, as you can see, became much more simplified, and all these, I put those little thunders there, just means that the information is transmitted automatically, which means that nowadays you need much less people to just generate documents that don't add value to a final product, and this is done much faster. Actually, in a couple of hours, the whole process can be already taken care of if it is efficient, compared to sometimes 3 days to 1 week that it took before. So here what happens is the trading partners can implement their network, and then there's a translation software that translates the things from one software to another. Now, when it comes to receiving the information, there's two chances here. You can, for example, have what we call an on-site decoder or translation process, which means that one of your computers works only on translating the information that comes from different suppliers, for example, and translating them into what are the necessary steps to be taken. But this means that you have really a computer that just works on this. For example, we call it on site. The other one is to have it on a cloud system, and the cloud does this for you. Now, the disadvantage is, for example, when you have it in a cloud, that means if the cloud system has a problem, you're also going to have a problem. But again, on the site, you could say the same thing. The other thing is that in terms of internet, the cloud system only works with good internet connection, and on site you don't necessarily need internet. Worst comes to worst, information could be sent, for example, through a telephonic line. I know that sounds very old-fashioned, but it could still be done technically, and therefore there's advantage, disadvantage, but to be honest, less and less we're using on site. More and more we're using the online or the cloud operating translation systems. Okay, in terms of value-added network, I just wanted to say that value-added network is a little bit like it's a network that receives, stores, and forwards electronic message containing EDI transmission sets, and a lot of times does translation for the specific characteristics of some of the EDIs in the network. Now, on the right, for example, you see is that I have all those different types of companies connected, or just one link to a van, to the value-added network, and the value-added network sends the information to whoever it needs. What is the advantage here is that each one of those does not need to be individually connected to each one of the other companies. In other words, I just need to be connected to one network, and that one network will manage all the necessary information that needs to go to each place. Now, this is very important in big operations, obviously. This is something that we're not talking about small businesses. But EDIs have many advantages. They provide translation between different transaction sets. Sometimes you don't need to have the same type of EDI software. Sometimes the VAN network will make sure that the translation is done smoothly. VAN performs as well automatic compliance checking and records messages activity in an audit log, which can be very useful in case there's a problem, for example. In terms of all this, like one of the major disadvantages was cost. Cost used to be, and I'm not gonna lie, it's still expensive, but the main advantage is that this cost has been decreasing, but at the same time, a lot of clients, for example, like let's imagine big manufacturing processes like the car manufacturing, all right, car manufacturing in industry. If you want to become a supplier for one of these big brands that produces cars, you need to adapt the software that they use, because otherwise you cannot even sell to them. And therefore, what does this mean? It means that unless you have the software that allows your company to communicate directly with the software of the client, they're not even interested to work with you. And many companies go through this because they know they can get a big client. So another application of this is something that you already know very well, which is electronic funds transfer. This is another EDI system that is used between banks. Just wanted to mention that in case you know that the banking industry also uses it, obviously, but we give it a specific name. One of the last things I want to talk today is about material tracking, especially if you're going to be working in manufacturing or in a more tangible product manner. So there's many technologies that allows us to track materials. I just want to give because many of you maybe don't know this, but one of the easiest ways we have to track materials is to use of barcodes. Obviously, they're quite cheap and they're quite widely used, but the fact is that the fact is that you need an active user to scan those things, or it takes a little bit more time. There's two technologies nowadays that in terms of material tracking are very important. Passive RFID, which is radio frequency signal, basically. And this is a device like you see at the bottom, like you see, it's nowadays they're becoming much cheaper. Nowadays they cost between 7 to 15 cents each. And basically you see them sometimes on books or on clothes, okay, in case as a theft situation, but they can also be used for tracking of materials. Okay, so for this you need a special reader, obviously a little bit similar to what you see outside of the stores, but this one collects more information and it allows you to know, for example, to read many more things faster. So if you go in a conveyor belt, for example, it's much quicker. Also allows the store of more information, and it's not so easy to damage, so that packages don't get lost. And therefore it's still quite cheap to use, but it can be a great way as well that looks better and can give more value as well to your customer. But one that I want to talk about is the active RFID. Now this one, for example, is much more expensive to use, between $15 to $100, and it's used mostly to track more expensive equipment. Okay, it can be read hundreds at the same time, and it has a much more wider range. So and it's obviously many of them nowadays come, for example, with a GPS tracker that allows you to track on real time where actually the package is. But because of the price, it is not convenient at all times to use it. Once again, it can be good if you're transporting materials that are expensive or they are fragile, and you want to know where they are at each point in time. But at the end of the day, this delivery is always about all this data that we're talking about. It's always about, in my opinion, creating the ultimate consumer orientation in the supply chain. In other words, delivering the best value for your customer, for your consumer. And the goal is always of deliveries is always to help each customer focus on meeting the needs of their customer. And one of the companies that does this the best is actually Michelin, in my opinion. So Michelin North America, they pioneered the use of internet technology to go beyond the next step in the value chain. So back in 1995, so years ago, 25 years ago, sorry. 25 years ago, they launched an online business initiative called the BIB Net. So the BIB Net allowed the retailers or the sellers of the tires to immediately access the inventories regarding specification, promotional information, allowed basically retailers to know in real time what was possible to do for the customer. And this not only saved money for Michelin, but it also created a lot of gave the dealers a better service because they were able to provide the information much quicker to the consumer. And Michelin, it's a company that has done many initiatives like this. They're always very focused on delivering value to the customer, and I believe that we can learn a lot from them, and I look forward to see what are the next things that Michelin will do. All right, so to summarize, we covered a variety of things today. We talked about purchasing and how purchasing has enabled us to find much more suppliers and better communicate with them online. We covered technologies to exchange data and why EDIs are important. And finally, we also covered what kind of aspects we should outsource or not. Okay, remember, we could outsource activities that don't add value to our final product, but we should avoid to outsource activities that are important for the value generation of our business. All right, so that's pretty much it for today. I thank you for your attention. If you have any questions, leave it on the comments. If you have any suggestions about videos you would like me to create in the future, also leave it in the comments. I always appreciate the ideas. And apart from that, that's it for today. Thank you very much, and I'll see you on next video.